Hi and welcome to the Dentro Talent Podcast. I am here with Chris Clarke, who is currently the CTO at Bibliu. And Chris, we're going to be talking about growing as a CTO and how you personally, but also how one kind of grows and develops as an individual when you're in that CTO role. Thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to me. I think what would be really, really helpful is just if you could give us a bit of a summary on where you've been, what you've done, and that will hopefully just kind of give some colour to what we're about to talk about.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Rick. So I guess I should probably start with Bibliu. So yeah, I'm the CTO here at Bibliu. So Bibliu's a digital learning platform, e-textbook aggregator, and actually in the US, which has some campus retail stores as well. Started about 10 years ago, came out of University of Oxford, who were one of the first investors, and has kind of grown to be his initial market was the UK, but latterly he's been growing quickly in the US. So I'm kind of new to Bibliu, but I suppose I'm not new to what you would call education technology. I had my own business this for a number of years with others as well that we kind of grew from around 2010 up to exiting it to a major US academic publisher in 2018, and
Right.
that was a learning platform as well. That was mainly UK focused, and I suppose I kind of cut my teeth as a CTO there really. So I guess we can talk about some of the lessons learned and how that went and how that kind of rolled out over that time.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think let's start there because obviously that when you joined and founded and started Talis, that growth is growth in a business, but also as an individual, you go through so many different roles. So, what do you think if you could pinpoint one thing that was your biggest learning, your biggest takeaway from that period? Um, what would you reflect on, and what would you say it is?
Yeah, I mean, my background before that was, I was a software engineer, and had been for around, I suppose, 10 years by the time I kind of took on the CTO role at Talis. And really, the biggest learning in that time was going from, Talis was a startup. It was literally four people to start with, Talis Education. And the biggest learning there was going from being an individual contributor, even in those early days as CTO, when it's a very small business and you've got to do most things, to really being what I would always call, and anyone who knows me knows I rattle on about this all the time, a catalyst for others, right?
Yeah,
So you can work 80, 100 hours a week, cutting code, doing whatever you need to do to get things done. But really, there's only so many hours in the week, and eventually you'll burn out doing that. And where the biggest learning is how you take that leadership term from being that superhero. I'm going to, solve all the problems. I'm going to work harder than anyone else, and make that turn to being a catalyst for others. So, when you've got 10, 20, 30 people depending on you, and you can make their work 10, 25% more meaningful, that's contributing way more value to the business and the organization you can ever do, like, taking on everything yourself. So there's two things there. You have to make that turn yourself, and that's something
Mm.
that we had to do quite early on at Talis. And then it's about helping those around you make that turn as well. You don't. Everyone needs to be CTO to have to make that turn, or CEO to make that turn, right? Really high performing companies do this all over their org chart, and they empower their leaders to be leaders, and think about how can they create the environment for others to thrive, right?
yeah,
And that's quite difficult when I was in my mid-20s, I guess, when I became a CTO, and mid to late 20s, and you're ambitious, and You want to get things done. And when you make that turn to being the catalyst for others, you have to kind of let that go a little bit. And you have to kind of understand the balance between always stepping in and correcting people's mistakes as soon as possible, between letting people run with things and understanding there's more than one way to get to the right answer, right? So, it's that balance, and where do you let people run with things, and when do you step in, and how you do that as well, and make sure you give like room for others, to kind of grow into that, and
Yeah.
coach and mentor other leaders, I guess. So I guess, there's kind of two evolutions there that I described. There's kind of doing it yourself, and then helping and mentoring others to do it, and recognizing, which people are able to do that, right? And where's that a latent talent?
Yeah. And did you always have that in the back of your mind? Like when you started it, were you like, okay, well, when we get to this point, that means I'll have to start to step away? Or was it something that just kind of morphed and changed as you just got busier?
Yeah. I mean, I was really, really lucky that I had people around me who were more mature and had done this before.
Yeah.
Actually, the
Yeah.
exec team at Talis, there were, out of the four of us, two of them had been CTOs before, they'd been execs before, and they were able to do that in return. They were doing exactly what I just described with me, right? And
Yeah.
early on, even before I was CTO, and I could see them doing it with other people as well. And also, I had the opportunity to get some external mentorship as well, and I think that was really quite formative. And you probably think, earlier on in your career, you don't know what you don't know, right? And you think you know most things. Why would you want that? And I think that kind of leadership, mentoring, and like having, the patience and the critical distance as well, someone else to be able to kind of play those situations through, was kind of formative, really.
Mm.
So, I'm really grateful for that. I don't think everyone has that opportunity, but I
Yeah.
think that, don't think you would necessarily automatically see that yourself. But
Yeah.
this happens all the time with boards. That's a lot of why they exist. Of course, and if you get like the right investors in a business, they will have seen these patterns before, and they can help entrepreneurs or younger people in their career to kind of recognize those things. So I think there was some help there. I was incredibly lucky, but I then. But yeah, I think ultimately, it's obvious, isn't it, that as you grow, you're not going to be able to do everything yourself, and you also kind of learn that by making some mistakes, right? So I can think of projects where I have been that kind of tried to be that superhero where I've tried to work all the hours and get them done, but you learn from that experience that you can probably do that like once a year,
Yeah.
6 months, and then you've got to go into a quiet period and be reflective about that. And if you do that all the time, you'll burn out and annoy everyone around you.
Yeah.
And I think I've done that. I think everyone who's been on a leadership journey has done that and
Yeah.
annoyed some people. But it's how you recover from that and be self-aware and reflect on it. I think that's important.
Yeah. And I think you kind of, from my own personal experience, I think you have to be ready to make that transition, from doer, in my case, in recruitment, salesperson, biller, to uh, leader, and having, the tools and the toolkit available to be able to do that, but also mentally, you have to be able to say, okay, that is not my job anymore. And I think it's a really difficult thing to do, particularly at a young age. Because, and I don't know for you whether it was you set out to be on that path, or whether it just kind of that's just how it happened. Did you have leadership ambition when you were a programmer, or did it just happen?
Yeah, I think I always wanted to be in control of my own my own destiny, and I always biased towards whether it was when I was a freelancer, when I was a younger engineer, or later when we were doing Talis. I always biased towards wanting to be in control of my own destiny, rather than there's plenty of careers you can do that are great careers where you can go and work for a large organization, and the organization takes care of you and you do good work, right? But I always wanted to be a little bit more free in the choices that I had and the
Mm.
direction that I had. And that's not to say I wanted to do things necessarily on my own, but do that with other like-minded people, right? That was always important to me.
Yeah.
So, that's an obvious, that's an obvious kind of reason why I suppose I tended towards that. I think just thinking back to what you were saying about when you made that transition, I think there's kind of one important thing that we did and we recognized quite early on was, especially in engineering, right? Because, a lot of engineers make a transition to like a team lead or, a kind of more director level role or VP role over time. The traditional thing with engineers is the way you get promoted is by becoming a manager and a leader, right? And I think we're always like super keen to provide an alternative path, right? You could still be a leader, but in the profession rather than be a leader as a manager and a kind of leader of, you could be a leader of your craft rather than necessarily just of people. And I think the other thing that we always did with leadership positions was we made sure that they came with a soft landing so
Yeah.
that we gave people the opportunity to try leadership. So, but we didn't lose an exceptional employee just because that turned out to be something they weren't ready for, they didn't enjoy.
Yeah.
Right. So it was always really important to set context with someone who is stepping into a leadership role that with the rest of the business and be really honest with the rest of the business. Say, we're going to try this out, but if it doesn't happen, that's okay. We can go back to how things were before. We'll try something different so that people didn't feel like, they'd been an exceptional um, individual contributor, they'd then gone into a leadership position and that hadn't worked out so well for whatever reason. So they now need to leave and go work somewhere else as an individual contributor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's a terrible outcome for the business, right?
Yeah.
So I think it was always really important to like set that soft landing. It's like trying any skill or new thing, right? You try it out in a safe environment for a period. If that goes well, you do more of it. If it doesn't, you do less of it and try something else. And it's
Yeah.
not, celebrate that failure to an extent, right? We talk a lot in tech and entrepreneurship about celebrating failure, but all too often in business, if someone takes on, that kind of role and doesn't do well, they feel like they need to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's a pattern that you see in startups, isn't it? Software engineer, product builder becomes CTO, doesn't have the leadership capability, or hires the wrong people underneath them, and then the whole kind of house of cards comes crumbling down, and then you end up having to replace, one of the founders or somebody who's been in the business from a very early stage, which obviously is not, it's completely counterproductive.
100%. I mean, what I did after Talis actually was that I ran a consultancy for a number of years until earlier this year called Scale Up CTO. And I had clients that, they were scaling businesses. I'd see this an awful lot. I go into
Yeah.
businesses, there was a founder CTO maybe, and that was their first gig, as it probably was everyone else who was on the founding team. And you get to a point, 3, 5, or 7 years in where it's a table flip and they leave, and
Yeah.
then we have to do something else. And I was exceptionally lucky that most CTOs will have gone through that journey if they've been entrepreneurs, right? They will have had that first gig where they were founder CTO first time, and that will either ended in a table flip or or not. Most people end in a table flip, and they'd have made that realization their next gig. They'll have reflected on that after some time
Yeah.
and done a lot better in the next one. I was really lucky that I had a more mature group around me that helped me go through that without flipping the table and having to go do something else. But yeah, it's something you see all the time, and businesses super struggle with it. And invariably, when I look back on it, and I've done a few gigs where I've had to go in and advise how to mop up, afterwards with that, and it's been the superhero and burnout
Yeah.
the CTO, and not understanding that there was that turn available where they now needed to build a team around them and help that team be leaders, and keep a watching distance but get involved when things were getting out of hand, but not all the time. And
Yeah.
pick the things that they were gonna the most important things that they were going to get involved in and kind of establish.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And is there anything for you that you can look back on, or maybe it's a point, an event, or maybe it was just something that happened over time, but is there a point at which your mindset and your mentality changed kind of into that more strategic business leader, I guess people inspirer into that role. Is there anything like key that you can say, right? Yeah, that was the point that happened.
Yeah, I think okay. So like our first product that we built. So the way that the company kind of came to being was it was actually funded out of like a wider group of companies, and one of those other group companies had a proprietary cloud technology quite early days, 2009, 2010, and at the time a decision was made that we would build all of our products, all the subsidiaries would build their products on this technology, and it turned out that we decided that this technology wasn't the right bet. It was based on graph databases, basically at the time, and it was really clear that Facebook and Google were going to dominate that space, right? And NoSQL was coming along, and everything kind of people were moving more stuff to the cloud. Still early days, but 2009, 2010, people were doing more and more with cloud technologies. And it was clear that big companies were going to own these platform as a service offerings, and our offering that we built our first version of our product on wasn't going to succeed commercially.
Yeah.
So while that was happening, right, I kind of there was a couple of things really. So this was kind of happening, but the business was in a bit of denial about it, and it was trying a few things to try and like solve this, and it was scrabbling around, and we'd created like an offshoot to try and see if we could solve that. But I think we all knew that wasn't going to be solvable. And I kind of went, look, I'm trying to do my education thing here. It's really clear to me that like I can't bet what I'm doing. I can't anchor, what I'm doing to this technology. So I had to kind of stick my head up over the parapet and say, I'm going to migrate away from this, right? And
Mm.
I'm going to die on that hill, right?
Yeah.
However unpopular that decision is in the group, I don't think that's going to work. And you're doing all this other stuff over here that you're concentrating. You're not concentrating on me as a customer. So um, I'm going to do what I would do with any other supplier. If I didn't feel I was getting good service, I'm going to move. And that was quite controversial because of what politically was going on. And, obviously me, and he is, on the board at that time. And, I think our chairman was really supportive in this. And he said, yeah, you should be able to choose like any other supplier. And they're not, dealing with you, like a good customer, you should be able to move. So we did, and we made a bet on, at the time, we made a bet on NoSQL, and we migrated the product across at a time when that product itself was commercially growing quite quickly.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
could see if we didn't make that decision then, we weren't going to be able to like grow our product because we were anchored to this kind of dead end technology that
Yeah.
was slowing us down. So there was quite a lot of personal risk there, but I think that was probably the first major decision where I really stuck my head above the parapet and said, "Look, we're not going to do that." And I know this is unpopular, but these are the reasons. And common sense prevailed. I got the buy-in that I needed from the board, thankfully. And actually, we closed that business unit down after.
Really. Right.
I think it was probably another 18 months it went on for, but eventually it was closed down
Yeah.
because they if you take risks and you're doing things right as an entrepreneur, some things work, some things don't. So, but I think I made the right bet. And by that time, I was 18 months down a different technology road. I think so that's the good part of that. The bad part of that is that, I put my superhero suit on, and me and one of my lead engineers who, to this day, I've got a lot of respect for him. He's actually still with the business now. Me and him locked ourselves in a room for 6 months and did this like port, which was nearly killed us, and really annoyed everyone else who wasn't doing it because we basically rewrote the whole thing and annoyed everyone else. And that was probably the wrong part of the decision, right? I should have
Yeah.
made the team to buy into it. But I just thought this is like one of those moments, right or wrong. It's a live or die. If we don't do this and it doesn't go right, then we don't have a business. We don't have a product. So we got to,
Yeah.
there's only like there's two people I trust to get this done. One of them was him. One of them was myself, and we did it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't, after doing that, and didn't even have time to drive home or drive in the evening. So I stayed in a hotel next to the office so I could work till 11 o'clock at night and get up the next day at 8 and do the same thing again. It was like, yeah, I'm done with those days. Those days are done, and now we need to get on with, building the team around us who are going to
Yeah.
do this in a sensible and sustainable way going forward. So that was
Yeah.
probably a bit of a watershed. One for sticking your head up and taking that brave decision and trusting your instincts. And two, for never do the 120 hours a week and possibly get divorced
Yeah,
again.
there's a lot of learnings just in that in that period of time, isn't there? So
Yeah.
that leads me pretty nicely onto what I wanted to talk about next, because it's an intense period to grow a company from zero to to what you grew Talis to. How do you, at the end of that, how do you kind of, I guess, almost not necessarily pick yourself up, but how do you brush that off and then say, right, I'm going to go again, and this is I need something else. Do you? How did you cope with it? Have that having been your life and locking yourself in the room and doing all the things that you did. So how did you cope with that, and how did you prepare yourself for what was next?
Yeah, I mean, we had a bit of a lead in to selling that business, and originally we were going to sell it around the time that the country was deciding a little thing called Brexit, and we actually had some good interest in the business from US firms, and then obviously a little thing called the Brexit vote happened around 2016. That interest turned into, let's see what happens to the value of sterling over the next that was frustrating, but we kind of had a 2-year lead in when we knew we were going to exit this business, and we eventually were approached 2 years later by a US firm and did that deal. But we had a bit of lead in, and we prepared well for it, in kind of mentally ourselves. I think the four of us had reached a point where overall we were kind of ready to to let that go and let someone else take that on to the next level, because the alternative was doubling down on it for another 10 years and risking quite a lot. Really our challenge was that we need to go break the US market, really,
Yeah,
to take the business to the next stage. And that's really difficult in ed tech. You need deep pockets, you need good relationships. And the company we sold to was a US company that had those pockets and those relationships. So it made good sense. There was good strategic sense for
yeah,
them to do it and not us. So I think we were mentally prepared in that sense. The other way that we were prepared, and this is something that we always think about anyway, regardless of whether you're thinking about an exit or not, is what's the succession plan, right, in your business. So if you're suddenly not there, you get hit by a bus, like that business should function, right? And I always used to say that, you know, executives should be able to go on holiday for 3 months and come back and the business is still like running itself, right? This is the advice that I latterly gave to CEOs and business owners when I had my consultancy. You should be able to go on holiday first for a week, then for 2 weeks, then for a month, and ultimately for 3 months. And the operation of your business will still work, right?
yeah,
And if you can't, then you need to think about what you're doing, because if the things that you're working on, like if you're working on things in a 1 month window and they all fall apart if you go away for a month, then you're probably working on the wrong things. So we're always very conscious about like thinking about like are working that way, are we working on the right things? But then also part of that is succession planning. And if something was to happen, God forbid, one of us had a health issue, or there was a family issue where we needed to disappear, which from time to time over that period, amongst all of us in the whole business, there was, how
yeah,
does the business survive without that key person, whether they're an executive or whether they're, the head of support or whether they're a tech lead? The business should be able to rally around that and kind of self-heal and continue to work. So we thought we kind of already designed our organization in that sense. And, we were very free with the sharing of information. We treated everyone like an owner. Everyone was involved and could have an opinion about decisions. I often said we ran it as a benevolent dictatorship. It wasn't a democracy, but we listened to people, and then some people were leaders and had to take that learning and make a decision based
yeah,
on what the knowledge and overall position of the business was, rather than their preference, right? So I feel that we'd already built an organization that was quite self-healing if some people were to disappear.
yeah,
And, for our role specifically, we planned and worked with those people over a number of years. We'd always been very honest that eventually we would probably look for an exit.
yeah,
So the business knew that was likely to happen. So when it did happen, it wasn't a shock. They were involved as much as we could involve them in that process. And we'd exited other businesses in the group before, right?
yeah,
We did one to Capita in 2011. So, the business knew that was our modus operandi.
yeah,
So it was easy to then plan and say, well, if I'm only here for a handover period, who's going to take on my role? I've been working with someone specifically to do that for a number of years. They'd been working in their teams with, the people that they managed for them to step up. So, the organisation that acquired us, obviously wanted us to tie into, 4-year contracts and whatnot. I think it was 3 years actually.
Yeah.
We eventually did the deal, but quite quickly I was saying to them, look, you don't need me 5 days a week. The organisation is designed to work without us. These people are great people. They need to see their own progression. How about I get out of the way a bit and we try it out with them? So, and that's what we did. I quite quickly went down to 4 days, which became 3 days, which then became I'll only work 1 day in the business and I'll work 2 days doing consulting in your wider business on things that are nothing to do with this business, but I'll still technically work for you. I think I think it was 3 years in the end, but the last year I think I literally had nothing to do in the Talis business. So it was all consulting elsewhere in the business. That we had this like gradual off ramp, and everything carried on working. Everything we'd set up together with the team worked, and we'd done our job well there doing the succession planning. So yeah, I think we were kind of mentally and actually well prepared for it. And I don't know how it is for other people, but I think anyone in that, any seasoned executives, CTOs, CEOs, CFOs, that they'll, that's part of the life cycle of what we do.
And I mean, it sounds like almost from the get-go there was a lot of planning and thought that went into, hey, what are the steps that we're going to need to take to exit effectively and as easily as possible. And again, I think this is, speaking to people who've lived through a cycle of some description with a startup or a scale up or an exit. It's not something that immediately is put in place. It's almost like a right. Are we ready now? Are we ready to sell? And then you almost have to unpick parts of the business that you've done because you haven't put those building blocks in place right from the start. I'm assuming this came from kind of the people that you set the business up with who lived through that process before. Mm-hmm. But is there anything, I guess, almost kind of advice that you would give to a CTO or somebody who is founding a business, scaling a business, to lead up to that as easily and smoothly as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to be, as a CTO, you've really got to concentrate on, the things that if you were to exit, every business has got like, cobwebs in the cupboard, right?
Yeah.
It's not about having a squeaky clean cupboard, because that in itself would be suspicious. But it's about it's about being conscious of the things that are really going to hurt you and are going to turn a deal away or lead to significant price chipping, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not about having a perfect perfect environment, but it's about being able to explain why things are the way they are. Sometimes it's not hasn't been commercially important to fix this, or this legacy system isn't giving us any trouble, so why would we spend money on replacing it when we can deploy that capital somewhere else? But don't get caught out by the obvious. Latterly, when I had my consulting company, a popular project that I was doing was pre-due diligence, right? So smart firms generally who had investors who'd done this a few times would say, yeah, okay, maybe you're thinking about like exiting in 3 years, right? Maybe we should just maybe do some like pre-due diligence on the tech stack, because we've got an opportunity now to fix a bunch of things, right? We're not going to fix them. If we get into due diligence, they get found out, we're on the back foot there. We're not going to be able to fix them. So, having that mindset of like, what is your risk register? What are the bits of that closet that are really creaky and are going to affect you? But, you can still be reasonable in that. So security is a great one. I always used to say to my team, right, we need to pay attention to security, but we don't need to be so obsessed by it that we have like zero risk on the risk register. But what we do need to do, a good test for that, is if there was to be an incident with a supplier and it affects our customers, have we taken steps that a customer would think are reasonable to mitigate that? So it's not about never having, having zero chance of like anything ever happening. It's that if something was to happen, do we have a reasonable explanation that we can explain in layman's terms of the steps that we took to mitigate that, or why that, So, I think that was an important like kind of principle. Like, you got to address where those things don't seem reasonable to a non-technical person. Those are probably the things you want to address. But you
Yeah.
don't need to be like 100% clean in all areas, and because you won't be, right? And
Yeah.
if you obsess about that, you're probably not paying enough attention to a major issue. Um, so, of course, there's some basics, and these days things are actually much easier. There's a lot of great, so in security, which is the area that we were just talking about, there's quite a lot of great products that weren't available, 10 years ago that
Yeah.
really, for a relatively small amount of money, really help you get on top and keep on top of those vulnerabilities. The other obvious one that I've seen when I've done like pre-due diligence is people relying on some, restrictive license open source library that they didn't even know they were using because they didn't look and do an audit. That was something we did way before we even thought about selling the company, and then kept on top of that.
Yeah.
So like AGPL and things like that. And I think just doing enough to show that you've been reasonable in all those areas is kind of good enough. Just be honest as well. If you do get into diligence, just if you try and hide things, people will think, well, why have those been hidden, and they'll prod more.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned there kind of the evolution of the technology in security, and I think it's it's extremely common knowledge that technology moves really, really quickly,
Yeah.
and the role of the CTO has evolved quite dramatically. I think over the last, I mean, definitely the last 10 years, but I think also the last five quite significantly as well. So, in terms of what you believe now and what you've seen, what are the core requirements of the modern day CTO, as opposed to perhaps when you first got that job title, or even before that?
Yeah, I think I think like the T in CTO is a center of gravity, not an absolute, right? So you need to be a rounded business leader that has a center of gravity in technology, rather than being the tech guy that we send all the tech stuff to, right? So I think what I've seen, kind of like in my consulting career, and what we did, and what I was encouraged to do was, be inquisitive, like be involved in the rest of the business and have an opinion about that, and use your center of gravity to help the other parts of the business excel, right? So a lot of CTOs that, certainly in the businesses that I consulted with, that I've been into, kept themselves busy with the technology side of it, keeping the engineering team going, keeping systems running. Have they ever been out on the road with a salesperson? Have they been
Mm,
to a customer sales meeting? Do they have an opinion on the marketing strategy? Do they understand like what the CFO actually does, right? Because that's really important, and actually can influence your the way you think about your projects as well. So a classic one for CTOs is understanding, like, the difference between OPEX and CAPEX. A lot of CTOs want to do everything in house and engineer all the things, where actually for your investors, you're better off outsourcing some of it and putting it in your CAPEX budget if you're doing a new one-off system, right? So understanding that, and having that rounder business knowledge, I think, is becoming more and more important. As I think the wider technology market is shifting from, being a kind of a cloak around, like, being like almost like the kind of wizard behind the curtain, keeping the computer running.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Well, actually, like, it's never been easier to start a career in, software engineering or computing, and there's so much knowledge out there, and you can learn a lot, and there's lots of AI assistance. So it needs to be more about being more domain specific, being more rounded, and seeing how you can apply that technology rather than just running the technology.
yeah,
And the other huge one is AI. And I'd be surprised in a week if someone didn't send me a Chat GPT summary of how to do an aspect of my job, right? It's the bane of my existence. Like, or someone else going, can we just do this with AI? Like, can we just get AI to do this? Like,
yeah,
and your role is with those like emerging technologies is to try and, rather than just roll your eyes and go, I wish people would stop doing that, or to say my job will be replaced by AI, is actually educating people about what the responsible use of that, what we can practically do, what we practically can't do, how that can influence our products and services, and what the good uses of that are and what the bad uses are. and make sure we're using it in the right way. In my earlier days as a CTO, it was social networking, right?
Yeah.
2007, 2008, those times. This is kind of very early days of iPhone, very early days of social networking, really. It wasn't a mainstream. There was a bit of it, but not in the way that we have now, where it's pervasive through the whole of society. What CEOs are talking about is, what app can I build? What iPhone app can I build? And what social network can we build? How can we turn our product into a social network? Well,
Yeah.
guess what? Layer that onto today, and what are people saying is, how can we turn our product into AI? How can we use AI to lead the world? How do I need to do AI because it's AI? Well,
Yeah.
technology goes in waves, right? If you look at it over the long term, way back, from mainframe, mini computer, client server, they're all waves of the same thing, right? There's a
Yeah.
hype curve, everyone drinks the Kool-Aid, and then it dies off, and the actual utility from that technology is pervasive and runs through. So cloud computing is just mainframe technology from the 60s done on a massive scale, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Everything's a dumb terminal today, right? Including your smartphone. It's not new. It's 70 years old as an idea.
Yeah.
So, I'm not saying AI is directly similar to that, but it's definitely got a hype curve. Machine learning's been around for a long time. The science has been around for a long time. We now have the computing power to do stuff with it, but it's quite dangerous to think it's going to solve all of our problems. And it's also dangerous from a business perspective, thinking we're all going to be AI companies. The way I think about it is, AI is a technology that every company is going to use, in the way that every company in the world uses a relational database now.
Yeah.
Of course, it's going to be something that we all use all day and every day, but it doesn't automatically solve all our problems and lead to profit. You still need to apply it in the right way. Understand that there'll probably be 5 suppliers of that technology at best, ultimately, in the world, that have got
Yeah.
very deep pockets. So it's about, how do you harness it, in the right way into your business.
Yeah. And look, the last thing I wanted to ask you is, a relatively standard question, but I always think it's quite a nice one to reflect on and to think about. If you were day one of Talis now, what would now Chris say to younger Chris about either something to watch out for, or learning? What's the nugget of information you'd give them?
Yeah, I think, slow down to go faster. There's a good book, The Slow Pace of Fast Change, which is probably 20 years old. It basically talks about this in 100 pages, but that's the 5-word summary of it.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you've got to slow down a bit and think of, the kind of longer game and what you're trying to get done. I think, reflecting back with the benefit of hindsight, we could have done what we did with Talis in 3 years, not 8. If we'd have made all, but you always can. So don't worry too much about those mistakes. Probably, it was frustrating at the time that we kind of did dead end projects and on certain things, but probably not to try and get too frustrated about that. It's just part of learning and getting to the right thing. And I think that team and culture is everything. Probably took a couple of years to get to the right place. With Talis, we got there in the end. I think we did an awesome job, and the fact that a lot of people are still working there. What is it now? 7 years after they were bought. I think it's great. I met someone the other day who's still there, and it feels like the same atmosphere, and they've carried that on with the new hires they've made as well, which is great. But so that culture is really important. It's sustained. Them and people. We assume that jobs and careers are very transactional, and I pay you this money, I give you this promotion, you do your best work. But I think people do their best work when they feel part of a movement, and they feel there's a good culture behind them, and people are acting with integrity. And we're all trying to move forward together. And I think you get more out of people that way than you do by paying them very large salaries and trying to sweat those assets, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's answered your question, but some thoughts.
Absolutely has, and I think there's a few tech businesses who found out the hard way that just paying the higher salaries doesn't guarantee you. It doesn't guarantee you good people, but also doesn't guarantee you longevity. Certainly over the last couple of years, when salaries really kind of 21, 22, when salaries just went nuts.
I know.
and it's kind of come back to bite people quite firmly on the rear end.
Actually, just on recruitment, that was quite interesting. We always made a point of like not competing on salary, because a candidate who was willing to go somewhere else for like another, 2, 3, 5, 10,000, like next year, like someone's going to be on the phone to them going, "Do you fancy applying for this role? It's a bit more money." There needs to be a good story about why they want to come and join you on your journey, right?
Yeah.
Do they love what you're doing? Do they love the sector? Do they, everyone wants to get paid what they're worth, right? And it wasn't about us not paying what we thought people were worth. But when we got into a salary negotiation with people go, "Oh, I've got 2 other offers. They're a bit more money." And I'd be like, "Well, is that the only reason why you're looking at those offers? What is it about those companies and those businesses that is meaning that, what is it? Because if it's just money, I'm not going to offer you any more money. You go take the money if that's your motivation,
Yeah.
because for the reasons I said, next year they'll just be going somewhere else." But, we competed and won on, not every time, but on people would have employment offers with Amazon and other great businesses. And we go, "No, we're not competing on salary. But what I can give you is, you'll come here, you'll love it, you'll enjoy working here. I've got engineers who've been here 7 years and, aren't thinking of leaving when the average turnover in the industry time, I guess, was under three. And you'll work on great problems. You'll feel good about doing it. You'll feel good about like the work you're doing. Or you can go to Amazon and probably earn a load of stock options and end up in a team doing a one-dimensional task and getting very well paid for it. If you want to do that, that's fine. But if you want to, have fun and be part of a mission, come to us."
Perfect. And I think that's a pretty good note to end things on. So thanks for taking the time to have a chat. That was really insightful. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.